Do you want to talk a little bit about the gender aspect of sports as well? And then I know this is a huge political topic with
Yeah.
the trans people in sports. I'll just tell you my perspective is like I don't even know why. Well, I know why, but I don't think this should be a political issue because it should be an issue for people like you who determine the health of the sport and how to compete and how finding places for people to compete.
I'll give you maybe kind of a roundabout kind of answer, and I think my perspective will be sprinkled in there a little bit, and perhaps my opinions will be sprinkled in there. But I taught a class a couple of years ago, a master's level class for sports administrators. So future maybe head coaches or athletic directors, leaders and key decision makers at the high school level in sports, right? So not just a high school coach, but an administrative leader of athletics of high school. So that those were the students. And the entire class was based upon inclusivity, and the gender question, of course, was a meaningful component of the class. And I organized the class not really as an opportunity for me to voice my opinion and allow students to voice their opinions on what we, quote, ought to do about it, but just to inform them on the journalistic approaches to it, the social justice issues that are being reported on, and then what the current legislation was and what the legislation might be. So really just let's gather information. So I assigned numerous readings for the class that were just newspaper clippings or digital downloads of news stories across the country that were concerning the issue. So of course, within those journalistic outlets, you've got perspective, you've got public opinion, you've got legislation that's discussed. We talked about the current state's legislature and legislative policies surrounding the topics. And then we talked about the way that some of the social winds were blowing and what the political and policy winds were blowing, so that in 1 or 5 or 10 years, when they find themselves as an athletic director, they're well informed of the topic. And perhaps they might even be ahead of the movement so that they can use whatever legislative or educational policies to their advantage, so that they could be providing a more inclusive athletics experience for all of their students. There was also an element woven into it which explored students with disabilities as participants in athletics, whether they be cognitive or physical. And there are certain K through 12 athletics that rewarded teams and schools and school districts for facilitating and encouraging their participation. So almost a separate point structure which affected the standings in a district. So a team on paper, in theory, could be elevated up a position by being more inclusive. And so, of course, people have their opinion on that. Maybe it's right or wrong. Everyone's for their own opinion. But the point of the class, and I guess the point I'm trying to make right here, is there are districts out there and there are states out there that are trying things, exploring with some inclusive strategies. And I err on the side of let's be inclusive. I err on the side of let's be safe and not put children in physical harm. And it could be that a key difference in testosterone is putting a person in harm, especially with a sport with a lot of power, with a lot of physicality. I'll use wrestling as an example. A person with more testosterone and more muscle mass, even if they have the same body weight, they're putting their opponent at a disadvantage. So I do want student athletes to be in a place where they're free of harm outside of just the innate harm that could happen during sport. But I err on the side of inclusivity. And I think for me, I obtained my perspective just by keeping up with it and not reading the news that's on like Facebook or Twitter, but like reading respectable news outlets and how it's being determined, how the rules of participation are being determined. So I do think that we're moving towards a more inclusive environment in all aspects of the educational system, and that includes athletics programs. And I think that's a good thing, but I don't think it means we stop exploring it, stop researching it, and look at the consequences, good and bad, so that we can always manipulate it and amend the rules just like we're doing now. So if in the year 2023, we come to some firm ironclad determination on who can and can't participate in men's sports versus women's sports, well, I think that that would be a disservice to our own intellectual ability to adapt and evolve and grow as a social, cultural, entity within using sport. I think allowing it rather to grow and change with society's input is pretty important.
You brought up the people with disabilities and letting them compete, and that reminded me of that kind of a dubious character that Oscar Pistorius. But I thought the case was interesting because the guy's got spring for feet. Like most, you'd often think that that's illegal. You can't put springs on your feet. But they found, and then I saw where they did an analysis. They thought that he would probably have an advantage for things like over half a mile, where just the energy efficiency would make it so it's like, this is obviously unfair. Whereas he has a huge disadvantage getting off the blocks and doing some sprints. So they found that sort of middle distance that he ran was like, okay, this is reasonable. We can,
fair.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. So they drill down on that, and they kind of, there's wheelchair basketball is a really, really entertaining, really valuable sport. The way they determine fairness with wheelchair basketball is you're given a category, a number to indicate your quote level of disability. So a person, an able-bodied person like me, I would be a 5. Okay, I possess no disability. A person that's going to be a double amp, a significant injury to the spinal cord, real high up and limited mobility, they would be maybe a 0.5 or a 1. All right. So in wheelchair basketball, you cannot have, oh gosh, I hope I'm not wrong, I think it's 13. You cannot have, with your 5 players that you've got on the court, a number above 13. So you've got to get kind of strategic if you're the coach there, right? So you got to make that work. Everyone's either a 0.5 all the way up to a 5, or a 0.4 technically, because you wouldn't have an able-bodied person playing the sport in the sanctioned governed version of the sport. So you got to get kind of creative there too. Now, a player is going to be much more valuable. Here's where gamesmanship comes into play. Much more valuable the lower their number is. So if I'm a 2, but I can convince the people that determine your rank and your number, because before a tournament starts, you do have judges and referees that make a determination of what your number is. If I can convince them I'm really only a 1.5, I just became a lot more valuable to my coach. You see what I'm saying? So again, you've got some gamesmanship and faking it a little bit. So it doesn't matter the sport or the level. Gamesmanship tends to permeate sports across the spectrum. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super interesting and a
Yeah.
good way to get, maybe not at like, I don't know if those kind of games and organizations will ever be, at the NBA, NFL level, because they're not going to be the elite athletes. But I think it's great to have those sort of organizations just to get as many people
Oh my gosh,
in
I think
and
it's
included.
so great. So yeah, the Olympics and the Paralympics, they're played at the same places in the same venues. The Olympics goes first, and they get a lot of national American attention, but in the exact same venues, the Paralympics follow. And so, of course, Paralympians, they are the world's finest athletes. They just have a disability. So other countries, they have a much higher value and appreciation of the Paralympics than we do. And I think that they're the winners of those countries because they're spectators to a really, really awesome sport. And for whatever reason, American culture just hasn't grown to appreciate it as much. But adapted sports and adapted athletes, they have the same dilemmas that able-bodied athletes have regarding using performance enhancement drugs, gamesmanship, sportsmanship, and all that. It's high level, high competitive, high stakes sports.